Today, in cities across the US, people are making decisions about their future. They're getting jobs, they're buying homes, they're starting families. Picture a young couple living in Jacksonville today who are buying their first home. They're probably thinking about current factors as they make their decision. What neighborhood they like, is it close to work, what schools are in the neighborhood. But that couple is also likely signing a 30-year mortgage. And they may not be thinking about whether in 30 years that neighborhood experiences chronic flooding, if they are late for work because the road they drive on was inundated with water, or if their kids can't play outside in the summer because it's simply too hot. Few people think about this level of uncertainty. They may not like thinking that far in advance, or they may not have the information to know how to think about these major issues. At best, uncertainty is uncomfortable, and at worst, it can be terrifying. But the truth is, the burden of thinking about uncertainty shouldn't fall on individuals. It's the responsibility of local governments to understand, analyze, and adapt to future uncertainty that has the potential to impact their residents. My name is Anne Coglianese, and I'm the Chief Resilience Officer here in Jacksonville, and I'm here to talk to you about how Jacksonville is using data in order to manage our future uncertainty and why this needs to be a central function of all local governments. Years ago, not only would a couple not be thinking about these big changes when they were making decisions, cities often didn't have to think about them either. But today, cities across the US are dealing with unprecedented levels of change, and nowhere is this truer than in Sunbelt cities across the southern US. Cities like Los Angeles, Phoenix, Houston, Austin, Tampa, and yes, here in Jacksonville. These cities have long benefited from the luxury of open space, a lot of it. They have grown outwards in seemingly endless and sprawling patterns of low-density development. But we're finding this open space to be less and less available, and the need to change patterns of growth more urgent. Now, Jacksonville is in one of the better positions as far as Sunbelt cities because we have still a lot of open, undeveloped space in our city. In fact, the majority of land area in Jacksonville is still open. But if future growth patterns continue in the same manner and pace as the past, what we found is Jacksonville will run out of open, undeveloped space in 80 years. Think about that. 80 years is a long time, but it's also a finite amount of time. And if we think about that couple who's buying a house today, 80 years could be the lifespan of their children. Our potential opportunity to shape Jacksonville's future will be determined in one generation. While open space may provide the landscape for growth potential, what will really determine the resilience of Sunbelt cities is how well government decision makers anticipate and respond to two primary drivers of change: climate change and population growth. Now, we're already seeing climate change cause massive disruption to weather patterns across the US. Sunbelt cities in the east are dealing with sea level rise and more active hurricane seasons, while cities in the west are dealing with more prolonged droughts and dangerous wildfires. And we're seeing all Sunbelt cities have the impacts of incrementally warmer summers and more acute and dangerous heat waves. Sunbelt cities are also all seeing an influx in population. Now, growth in general, it's a good thing for cities. It brings about new people with new cultures and talents. It brings new industries with economic opportunity, and it brings about a larger tax base. However, if cities are not prepared for population growth, it can put a strain on already scarce resources, things like affordable housing, utilities, roadway networks, and that can cause massive disruption. And if cities neglect both climate change and population growth trends, what they could see in the future is more residents, vastly more residents, living in areas that are high risk. Here in Jacksonville, we're no stranger to flood risks, given our location on the Atlantic Ocean and the presence of the St. Johns River and its many tributaries. We often see numerous types of flooding, from high tides to coastal surge to rainfall events and high river flows. And often what we're finding is that these different types of flooding are layered and they're compounding impacts. We also know that climate change is going to dramatically increase the frequency and intensity of these flood impacts. Here in Jacksonville, we're expecting to see upwards of 2 times as many extreme rainfall events and possibly 12 times as many high tide events by mid-century. We're also primed for some substantial population growth. In fact, in the next 50 years, Jacksonville is likely to see 685,000 new residents, which would bring our total population to about 1.6 million. And the City of Jacksonville did something smart. They recognized these trends, and they made the decision that we needed to get ahead of them. And we're leaning heavily on data to do so. We can actually put numbers and data behind different future development scenarios and compare these scenarios and allow that to guide our planning, our policy changes, and our infrastructure investments. The first thing that the City of Jacksonville did was think about a future without action, looking at a business as usual scenario where we allow growth to continue in the manner and style of the past. And in the past, in the last 20 years, we've seen 85% of new development in Jacksonville coming online as suburban areas. And typically, that suburban area has been built out into areas that were previously rural. And we know that developing that much rural open space can have numerous negative consequences. Increased flooding, reduced wetlands and biodiversity, and an increase in extreme heat. But what we've been able to use data to do is actually quantify these negative impacts. And what we found is that in a business as usual scenario where we do not change course or take action, we are likely to see in the next 50 years 3 times as many residents vulnerable to extreme flooding, 2.5 times as many assets like homes and hospitals vulnerable to flooding, and 1.5 times as many people vulnerable to extreme heat. The good news is that Jacksonville's growth in the future doesn't have to look like its growth in the past. We don't have to accept business as usual. Our data analysis has allowed us to build a really compelling argument for why growth needs to be at the center of Jacksonville's resilience and future planning. One way that the city can shift course is by primarily targeting areas that are low risk for dense new development. So if that first scenario is a business as usual where we don't change anything, let's think about some scenarios where we do. And I'm going to highlight for you today 2 scenarios that we ran through, and we've looked at a couple. One would be if we targeted our urban core as a central place for people to move. And another would be if we really build out and infill vacant lands in areas that are already existing suburban. And in both of these scenarios, we eliminated any part of Jacksonville that was in the current or future anticipated floodplain due to climate change. So all of that new development would be going in low-risk areas. Under a business as usual scenario, we know that about 1% of residential growth is likely to happen in our urban core. But what if that were to change? We're already seeing in cities across Florida and the US that people are seeking out urban areas because they provide connected and walkable neighborhoods and communities. So let's think about whether through deliberate action or just market forces, Jacksonville were to see a boom and a shift towards people moving into our urban areas. It may be unrealistic to imagine that every new resident coming to Jacksonville is going to move to downtown or the urban core, but we looked at a scenario where just half of new residents in the next 50 years move to the urban core. And what we found is that our population density would increase by 6.5 times in that part of the city. And that would bring our population to about what it is in greater downtown Miami today. And in this hypothetical scenario, we can see 11,000 fewer residents living in areas that are vulnerable to flooding as compared to the business as usual, and 80 square miles of open space preserved as compared to business as usual. In this second scenario we ran, we looked at suburban space, and what we found is that if we targeted all new growth, all 685,000 new residents to Jacksonville, if they were to move into existing areas that were suburban, and if development were to really build out vacant land in those spaces to accommodate that growth, what we would find is 90,000 fewer residents vulnerable to flooding and over 100 square miles of open rural space preserved. While these are just 2 scenarios, they provide a foundation for how we can weigh the benefits and the consequences of different future actions on development. And they can give us insight into what different growth patterns how they might impact residents. Perhaps We don't want our downtown to look like Greater Miami. Maybe that's too many people. If even a quarter of new residents were to move to downtown, it would bring the population of downtown Jacksonville to what it was back in 1950, right before the city and the county were consolidated. Maybe we're more comfortable with that scenario because it looks like something that's happened already, and we know that area can accommodate it. Maybe we can encourage more residents moving to suburban areas and maybe some new growth into open rural space, but less so, and we can see more of the benefits of preservation. With data and scenario planning, we can really look forward. And we can help ensure that young couples today and all of our residents are able to continue to have safe, vibrant, and livable places to raise their families, to grow old with their children, without having to worry about whether their neighborhoods will be livable decades from now. Thank you.